You feel the iron close around your fingers. Cold at first, almost gentle. Then the executioner begins to turn the screw, and you realize with absolute clarity that this is not meant to kill you. This is meant to unmangle you so thoroughly that every person who sees your hand for the rest of your life will know exactly what you are. The crowd leans forward. They've seen this before. They'll see it again next week, but they never look away. I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It amazes me that a story from medieval Europe can reach people across the entire world. All of us trying to understand how justice could look like this. The device itself was almost disappointingly simple. 2 flat iron plates, thick as a man's wrist, connected by a threaded screw mechanism that any blacksmith could forge in an afternoon. It sat on a wooden table in town squares across Germany, France, the Low Countries, England. Some were ornate, engraved with crosses or Latin phrases about righteousness. Others were just crude iron, stained dark from use. The simplicity was the cruelest part. This wasn't some exotic torture chamber hidden in a dungeon. This was a tool of public justice, operated in broad daylight, sanctioned by law, watched by children. They called it different names depending on where you were standing. In German territories, it was the Daumenschraube when applied to thumbs or simply hand press for the full hand. In France, le brise-main, the handbreaker. In England, they were more direct. The hand press, the finger pillory, the bone crusher. But regardless of the language, everyone understood its purpose the moment they saw it. This was what happened to thieves. Not all thieves the wealthy could pay fines. The connected could negotiate. But if you were poor, if you were a stranger, if you had no one to speak for you, and someone with status pointed at you and said that one stole from me, then your hand was going between those plates. The worst part wasn't even the device, it was the speed. A merchant notices his purse is lighter. He looks around the marketplace, he sees a beggar he passed earlier, now buying bread. That's enough, he calls the bailiff. The beggar is seized. Within hours, sometimes within the hour, the trial is over. The beggar insists he earned that coin doing odd work at the docks this morning, but he has no witnesses. The merchant has certainty and respectability. The magistrate barely looks up from his ledger as he pronounces judgment. Guilty hand press, noon tomorrow in the square, and that's how fast your life could end in medieval Europe. Not with death, which would be merciful, but with the systematic destruction of the body part you need for absolutely everything. They'd bring you to the platform the next day. Market day was preferred because the crowds were thick and the message needed to spread. The executioner was often a man who'd inherited the position from his father, who'd inherited it from a dynasty of professional pain. These men lived in specific houses on the outskirts of town, painted a particular color so everyone knew whose home it was. No one wanted them as neighbors, but everyone needed them. They were paid well, sometimes better than the baker or the blacksmith, because society required their services constantly. The executioner would force your hand onto the lower plate, palm down, fingers spread. If you tried to make a fist, guards would pry your fingers apart. The executioner had done this hundreds of times. He knew exactly how to position the hand for maximum effect. Then the upper plate would be lowered into place, resting gently on the back of your hand. Not painful yet, just pressure, just weight. Then he'd begin to turn the screw. The first rotation just increased the pressure. Uncomfortable, like someone pressing down on your hand firmly, you could still breathe normally. You might even think, wildly, irrationally, that maybe this won't be so bad. The crowd, which had been murmuring, would go quiet now. This was the moment they'd come for. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Apprentices abandoned their work. Housewives set down their baskets. Everyone watching, everyone waiting. Another turn of the screw, the pressure became pain. Not sharp, not stabbing, but a deep, bone-level ache that spread from your palm up through your wrist. Your instinct was to pull away, but the guards held your arm locked in place. You couldn't even shift your weight. You were forced to stand there and experience every sensation with absolute clarity, unable to move, unable to escape, unable to do anything but feel what was being done to you. Another turn, the small bones in your hand, 27 of them, each no bigger than a dried bean, arranged in a precise architecture that took millions of years of evolution to perfect, began to compress. These bones weren't meant to handle this kind of force. They were designed for manipulation, for tool use, for the gentle precision that separates humans from animals. The metacarpals in your palms started to bend. You could feel it happening inside your own body, a sensation that violated every instinct, that felt fundamentally wrong in a way that made your mind scream, even before the real pain arrived. The executioner paused, not out of mercy, but to let the moment breathe, to let the crowd absorb what they were seeing, to let you understand that this had only just begun. He'd checked the screw's threads, ensure everything was properly aligned. His face showed nothing. He'd seen every reaction imaginable. The stoic ones who tried not to scream, the defiant ones who cursed him, the ones who begged, who promised anything, who called on God or their mother or anyone who might make this stop. It never stopped. Not until the job was done. Another turn, the metacarpals cracked. Not a clean break like snapping a branch, but a slow splintering, a fracture that spread through the bone like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The pain was no longer just pain. It transcended into something else, a sensory experience so overwhelming that it whited out thought, that reduced you to pure animal response. You screamed. Everyone screamed. Eventually, the executioner had learned to position himself slightly to the side to avoid the spray of spit and vomit. The crowd watched with expressions that were hard to read. Horror? Yes. Satisfaction? Definitely. These were people who'd been robbed, or knew someone who'd been robbed, or were terrified of being robbed. They worked hard for every coin. Their possessions were the difference between survival and starvation. A thief wasn't just taking property. They were attacking the entire fragile system that kept ordinary people alive. So they watched the hand press turn, and they nodded. Good, right, deserved. But there was something else in their eyes, too, a kind of fascinated revulsion, an inability to look away, even though part of them wanted to. They were watching a human body being systematically destroyed, and it was horrifying, and it was mesmerizing. And it was happening just 15 feet away, where they could see every detail. Another turn. The phalanges, your finger bones, began to shatter. These smaller, more delicate structures didn't crack. They exploded into fragments. Splinters of bone ground against each other, grinding like gravel under a cartwheel. Cartilage tore with a wet sound that some in the crowd could hear. Ligaments snapped like overstretched rope. Blood pooled under the skin, unable to escape, turning your flesh a deep purple that spread like wine spilled on cloth. Your hand was transforming before your eyes into something that didn't look human anymore, into a swollen, misshapen mass that pulsed with agony. But here's what the historical records reveal that makes this infinitely worse. The executioner knew exactly how far to go. Too little, and the hand might heal partially, might retain some function, and the punishment would be incomplete. Too much, and you'd die from shock or blood loss right there on the platform. And a dead body couldn't serve as a walking reminder of what happens to thieves. So the executioner had been trained, had apprenticed under masters of this craft, had learned the precise point where maximum damage met guaranteed survival. He was an artist of controlled destruction, and your hand was his canvas. When he finally stopped turning the screw and opened the plates, what emerged was barely recognizable as a hand. Bones crushed into fragments so small they'd never knit properly. Fingers bent at angles that defied anatomy. Skin split in places where bone splinters pushed through purple flesh. A physician was often present not to help you, but to ensure you wouldn't die immediately, because that was the genius of the hand press. It destroyed you without killing you. You would survive. You would live for years, decades even, and every single day you would look at your ruined hand and remember this moment. And every single person who saw you would know what you'd done. They'd wrap your hand roughly, often with cloth that hadn't been cleaned, because preventing infection wasn't part of the punishment. Surviving infection was just another test you'd have to pass. Then you'd be thrown into a cell for a few days while the initial swelling set in. The pain would evolve, changing from the acute agony of the crushing to a deeper, more persistent suffering that radiated up your arm and made sleep impossible. Fever would come as your body tried to fight the massive trauma. Some people died in these cells, and their bodies would be dumped in a pauper's grave without ceremony. But if you survived, if you made it through those first critical days, you'd be released back into the world with your hand locked in its crushed position. Fingers frozen at awkward angles, palm unable to open or close, completely, permanently, catastrophically useless. You couldn't hold a tool, couldn't grip a weapon, couldn't even feed yourself properly without humiliating difficulty. Getting dressed became an ordeal that could take an hour. In winter, when you couldn't properly grasp firewood or wrap a cloak around yourself, Exposure became a real threat. Many victims of the hand press died in their first winter, not from the injury itself, but from their sudden inability to perform the basic tasks required for survival. And everywhere you went, people would see your hand. The baker would see it when you tried to buy bread. Employers would see it when you begged for work, and they'd turn away because what job could you do with one functioning hand? Marriage prospects would evaporate because who wants to bind their life to someone who can't work, who'll always be a burden? Children would point, and their mothers would kneel down and whisper, "See that man? That's what happens to thieves." You became a walking sermon, a living cautionary tale, a permanent public service announcement about the consequences of crime. Your destroyed hand was your criminal record, written in scar tissue and crooked bone, visible to anyone who looked at you. But here's the detail that transforms this from merely brutal to genuinely tragic. The system valued speed over truth. A trial could take less than an hour. The accusation would be made. The accused would deny it. If you were poor, if you were a stranger in town, if you had no witnesses to vouch for you, the magistrate would almost always side with the accuser. Why would a respectable merchant lie? Why would a property owner make false accusations? The logic was circular and damning. Honest people don't get accused. Therefore, if you're accused, you must be dishonest. Medieval town records preserve the story of a miller named Hans, accused of stealing grain in 1487. A wealthy landowner claimed 3 sacks were missing from his storehouse and named Hans as the thief. Hans denied it. He said he had purchased the grain legally from a traveling merchant. But he had no receipt, no witnesses, no proof. The landowner had status, confidence, and the town's trust. Hans had none of these. On a Tuesday morning, Hans's hand was placed into the press. By Thursday, he was back at his mill, trying to understand how to operate heavy machinery with one working hand. 2 weeks later, the real thief was caught with stolen grain still in his possession. He confessed and described the theft in detail. The authorities recorded this information carefully. Hans received no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement of error. According to the town ledger, the response was simple. The process had been followed correctly. Hans could no longer work his mill. Milling required 2 strong handsmen to guide the grain, one to adjust the stones. Within a year, he lost his business. Within 2 years, he was begging in the streets, holding up his crushed hand for coins, transformed into the very warning the punishment was meant to create. 3 years after his conviction, he was found frozen in a ditch during winter. All because a wealthy man had been wrong, and the system had no mechanism for undoing damage once the screw had turned. In 1532, a seamstress named Catherine in Lyon suffered a different punishment with the same result. A silk merchant accused her of theft. Catherine insisted she had purchased the silk legally and that the merchant must be mistaken. He was adamant. He recognized her face. She was branded with the fleur-de-lis, the mark reserved for thieves. The brand destroyed her life. Customers vanished. Her landlord evicted her. She became unemployable, unmarriageable, permanently marked. 3 years later, another woman was caught stealing from the same shop and confessed to multiple thefts, including the one Catherine had been blamed for. The details confirmed Catherine's innocence. Authorities acknowledged the mistake. The correction appeared quietly in a ledger. Catherine received no compensation, no public vindication, and no removal of the brand, which could not be removed. Her innocence existed only on paper. These cases were not rare. Town records across Europe contain many similar examples, only the ones where the truth eventually surfaced. Countless others never received even that small correction. Innocent people were mutilated, branded, and executed for crimes they did not commit, while the guilty sometimes walked free. The system recorded its procedures, not its failures. The crowds who gathered to watch punishments believed they were witnessing justice. They crossed themselves and murmured prayers, asking God to guide the executioner's hand. They believed divine judgment was at work, that if the accused were truly innocent, God would intervene. The logic was circular and unbreakable. Suffering proved guilt. Innocence would be protected. Therefore, anyone who suffered must deserve it. Trial by ordeal operated on the same assumption. Hold a red-hot iron and walk 3 paces. If the wound healed cleanly, innocence was proven. If it festered, guilt was confirmed. That all burns fester without medical care was irrelevant. The system was designed to produce guilty verdicts automatically. The hand press had other uses as well. It was applied to accused witches before execution, to heretics to force recantations, to political prisoners to break resistance. Theft was simply the most common justification. Because the device was legal, public, and blessed by clergy, it carried moral authority. This was not considered cruelty. It was civilization enforcing itself. The presses were maintained with care, screws were oiled, iron plates were cleaned. Some bore inscriptions from scripture or phrases about justice. They were stored in town halls or bailiff offices, ready to be used. Theft was common in an era of scarcity and hunger, where survival often meant transgression. The press came out regularly. The executioner earned his wage. The crowds gathered. Bones cracked. The system continued. Some of these devices still exist today, behind museum glass with placards explaining their historical context. Tourists photograph them and marvel at medieval brutality. They reassure themselves that humanity has progressed. But for those who felt the screw turn, who heard their own bones splinter, whose lives collapsed into poverty and shame afterward, whether guilty or innocent, the press was not an artifact. It was the dividing line between before and after. Before it, life contained possibility. After it, only survival. The most unsettling truth is that the people who operated this system believed they were just magistrates, thought they were protecting order. Executioners believed they were serving God. The crowds were convinced that visible punishment prevented chaos. They never questioned whether destroying innocent lives undermined justice itself. They valued speed over truth, certainty over accuracy, spectacle over fairness. The hand press is gone now, melted down or locked behind glass. But the beliefs that sustained it, the faith that harsh punishment prevents crime, that the accused are probably guilty, that errors are acceptable costs, that suffering ensures safety have not disappeared. They have simply taken new forms. History judges medieval justice harshly, yet its architects were certain they were right. They believed they were civilized. They believed their system was just. The screw turned, the bones cracked. The crowd watched and called it justice. Somewhere in that square, an innocent person screamed for a crime they did not commit. Their scream sounded no different from the guilty ones. The iron plates could not tell the difference. Neither could the crowd. In a system that values certainty over truth, the machinery of justice grinds forward without mercy. And anyone, at any moment, can be next.